So in this video, I'm going to show you how I create my quilt binding. I use a 2-inch wide double fold straight of grain binding. And here you can see what it looks like from the front and from the back. On the front, I machine sew it on. And when I turn it to the back, I hand stitch it on. And here you can see where I hand stitch it. So I'm going to show you how to make this type of binding. So I'm going to be binding the Signet quilt. This is a wall hanging or stroller quilt that I have available on my website for free if you want to find the pattern. The first thing I'm going to do is, once I've trimmed all the edges clean and after quilting, I'm going to measure the length and the width of the quilt through the center using a tape measure. So I take a center measurement going across the width of the quilt, which in this case is 35, and down the length of the quilt, which in this case is also 35. So to calculate how much binding you'll need, you'll add the length of one side and the width of one side of your quilt. That equals A. A times 2 to get all four sides equals B. B plus an extra 10 inches to allow for mitering corners and finishing the ends is the total amount that you need for your quilt, which we'll call C. So in other words, if my quilt is 35 inches wide and 35 inches long, that is a total of 70, which is A. 70 times 2 is 140, which is B. And then B plus an extra 10 inches is 150 inches. So in order to bind this quilt, I'll need 150 inches of binding, and that is C. So from there, you're going to take C and you're going to divide it by 42 inches. That is the figure that I use for the width of quilting weight fabric minus the selvage edges. So from selvage to selvage, and that's going to give you D. D is the number of strips that you will cut from your fabric. So if you multiply D times 2 inches, which is the width of the strips we're going to cut, you will get E, which is the total amount of fabric you need for your binding. So if you're looking through your stash or if you're going to the fabric store, that will tell you how much fabric you need. So for 150 inches of binding divided by 42, I'm going to need 3.57 strips, which I am always going to round up, and you should too. So I'm going to round that up to 4 strips. 4 times 2 2-inch wide strips equals 8 inches. So a quarter of a yard is 9 inches, so I could potentially buy a quarter of a yard. I may buy a little bit more than that just to make sure that I have enough. But that will tell you how much fabric that you need to create your binding. Cut your strips of binding from your fabric yardage. I fold the fabric in half with the fold closest to me on the cutting mat and the selvages meeting on the opposite side. And I'm going to establish a clean edge on the left-hand side to cut from. I have a long ruler. This is a 24-inch by 8-inch ruler that I use. And the way I establish a clean edge is I use this and another ruler side by side. So I line up a line on the ruler with the folded edge of the fabric, and then I bring in a second ruler, which I line up with the first ruler, which gives me this. I do this because I'm right-handed. You would reverse all of this if you're left-handed, and this just keeps you from moving the fabric unnecessarily. So I'm going to cut using the left ruler. So now I have a clean edge, and from there I cut the number of strips that I need, which in this case is 4. I cut those by lining up the 2-inch line increment on the fold, and I also pay attention to the vertical cut line I just made. And then I'm going to cut my strips from that. At the sewing machine, lay the first strip off to the left, right side up. Lay the second strip pointing towards your lap like this, right side down. So the right sides are together. And then you're going to stitch a diagonal line from corner to corner exactly like I'm doing here. So I'm restitching this line just so that you can see it better. And then I chain piece these edges, so don't cut your thread. When you finish sewing that, you take the strip that's in your lap and you're going to reposition it so that now it is the strip going off to the left, right side up. And then you're going to add a new strip coming from your lap, right side down. Cross them just like that and stitch again. And then once again, the strip from your lap becomes the strip going off to the left, turn so the right side's up, add the next strip, and you would keep doing this to join all of the pieces required. When you finish, you'll trim away all of the seam allowance beyond 1/4 of an inch, and then you'll finger press these seams open. You can do this at the ironing board or by hand. So here is my finished binding. At the sewing machine, after I pressed the seams open, I folded the entire length of the binding in half, wrong sides together, and pressed them open. So here's what the seam looks like inside, and then you can see how I pressed everything in half lengthwise. You're ready to sew the binding onto your quilt. So you're going to work from the front of your quilt, and you're going to line the folded or the cut edges of your binding up with the cut edges of your quilt. And I leave about 5 inches or so of the binding unsewn, and you can mark this with a pin. I usually just eyeball it and hold it in place when I take it to the sewing machine. But you're going to start stitching. I stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I usually use my patchwork foot. You can use a walking foot, but just know where that 1/4 inch seam allowance is. Back at the sewing machine, I've got my patchwork foot, 1/4 inch lined up with the edges of the quilt and the binding. I've got about 5 inches beyond the presser foot that I won't sew down just yet. And I start by back stitching just a couple stitches, and then I start going forward. And I'm going to do this until I get to my first corner. So when I get a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt, and I've just figured out how to eyeball this using a little mark on my patchwork foot, but you want to stop a 1/4 inch away as you get up to that. When you get up to that point, stop. You don't need to backstitch. I turn the quilt 45 degrees and I stitch off diagonally off the edge of the quilt. I turn the quilt 1/4 turn, and then to miter the corner, you're going to fold the fabric of the binding up like so, and then back down, aligning the fold with the edge of the quilt you just stitched. So here you can see the little fold that I just made. And then you're going to start stitching from the very edge. You don't need to backstitch. And you just keep going till you get to the next corner, and you would repeat the same thing for that and every other corner. Okay, I have sewn the binding to all 4 sides of the quilt with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I've done the corner mitering the way that I demonstrated in the last segment, and this is what I have left. And now I'm ready to join the 2 edges, the 2 ends of the binding. So on the left hand side is my beginning edge, on the right hand side is my ending edge. To do this, lay your quilt out flat and lay the ending edge of the binding over the beginning edge, allowing that beginning edge to sort of peek up just a little bit from the top so that you can see it. And you definitely want these straight. So lay them out straight, and then using a ruler, you're going to want to have these overlap no more than 2 inches, as you can see. And 2 inches is the width of the strips that we cut. So if you cut, I don't know, 10-inch wide strips, you would want them to overlap by 10 inches. So that is the key. So here we will overlap by 2 inches. Next, you're going to want to open up the folds of the beginning and the end sides of your binding. And it's also a really good idea to sort of roll the quilt up a little bit, as I've done here, just to give yourself a little slack. Lay the beginning edge unfolded flat on your work surface, right side up. Lay the ending edge wrong side down, unfolded over the beginning edge. And they're now lined up perpendicular, just as they were when we were sewing the lengths of quilt strips together. And it's kind of tricky. You want to make sure they're lined up pretty neatly. So it's helpful to pin. I do pin a couple of spots here just to keep them together, because you'll need to keep them together to get them to the sewing machine. Check the back, make sure everything's lined up and even. And then using a marking tool, I use a friction pin, use your favorite marking tool, and a ruler. You're going to want to draw a diagonal line, which will be your stitching line, and it's going to go from corner to corner diagonally, as I have shown you here. You want to make sure you get both edges. So I'm back from the sewing machine, and I've sewn across that line that I drew, and I've created this diagonal seam, just like when we were sewing the lengths of binding together. I lay it across my quilt to make sure that everything is lining up and smooth. Only then do I trim away the excess seam allowance, trim it down to 1/4 inch. And then, rather than lugging the whole quilt to the ironing board, I just finger press this open. From there, I lay it back down on the edge, and at this point I will usually add a few pins before I stitch. But once I do that, I will stitch from where I left off to the very beginning. And what this creates is a smooth join and a bumpless binding. It will be hard to tell where you joined your binding ends. Once I do this, I take the quilt over to the ironing board and just press the binding away from the front of the quilt. And all the time I'm doing this, I'm checking to make sure I don't have any gaps or holes or anything like that. From there, I like to use my favorite binding clips to hold the binding to the back of the quilt. And usually I'll just pin one side at a time, or clip one side at a time. At which point, once I've clipped a side, I will sit down and watch trashy reality television and hand stitch the binding to the back. And I'll remove the clips as I go. And I'll trim all these ends as I go as well. When I get to the mitered corners, I just fold them in. I trim the end, or trim the threads, and I fold them in. And when I get to those with my thread, I will take a few little tiny stitches through the miter to make sure that it stays in place.